Okay, we can go ahead and get started. So hello everyone, and thanks for joining Spotlight on Data Quality, Clinical Research and Trials. Before we get started, I want to introduce you. My name is Jordan Leibniz, and I'm part of the marketing team here at IMO. First off, this webinar is being recorded and will be available to you for future viewing. Throughout the session, all attendees will be in listen-only mode. If you have any questions, please type them into the questions section on your GoToWebinar console. We will get to as many questions as we can during our Q&A, but if for some reason your question is not addressed, we'll follow up with you after the presentation. Today, our Senior Sales Engineer, Andre Namey-Rad, will be speaking. As mentioned before, if you have any questions or comments while our presenter is speaking, please type them into the questions section on your webinar console. With all of this being said, I will pass it over to Andre.
Great, thank you, Jordan. Yeah, hi team, Andre Namey-Rad here, sales solution support for our growth side. Have a lot of experience in research use cases across the industry. And today we'll talk about how organizations like yourselves might be able to address some key concerns and some key problems within the research and insights into populations use case. So the market situation that we have noticed, clinical trials, patient engagement use cases like this for research, and then the patients who participate in them help shape the future of medicine. You know, taking part of a clinical trial is really truly a personal decision, one that any kind of patient should and does carefully consider themselves. But when you think about trying to find those patients for appropriateness, or those that might be interested in doing these kinds of things, through clinical trials, docs can find better ways to prevent diagnoses, treat diseases, look at medical conditions in different ways, look at research studies, publish on those research studies. But the big problem that everybody always deals with on a regular basis is that insights into those patients, insights into the longitudinal representation of that patient, trying to find that needle in a haystack that might be interesting to gain insights into that patient for a drug trial, those cohort queries change quite drastically over time. The standards change, the representation of that data changes as organizations like yourselves bring in new hospitals, bring in new data sets within the organization. Those business use cases, those queries will change quite drastically over time. And then also to increase that probability of finding those kinds of patients, you actually might be partnering with other outside organizations to bring that data in. And these are all, again, different disparate data sets that don't exactly align to each other. And not only that, but if you're trying to bring in those different data sets and you're trying to still use those same cohorts, you're probably dealing with a difficulty to maintain them over time. Again, because the standards change, the representation of that patient data might change, and you need to make sure that you're not only being solid on outcomes measurements, but that as you're trying to do clinical trials and insights into those patients and see what the outcomes of these drugs might look like, you need to be accurate in the representation, especially over time of that data. And these are all problems that I'm sure everybody here on the line has dealt with on a regular basis. So when you think about being in the trenches in here, understanding data governance, understanding clinical trial insights, especially over time, how can you make sense of the data? Well, let's take, for example, a data point that might be present within the data that you're researching. So a doc, an oncologist, radiation or medical oncologist might type in something like malignant neoplasm of the breast stage 3. And if I'm using, let's say, billing data, ICD-10 codes as an example, I know that this is a breast cancer patient. Interesting enough, there is not a stage 3 breast cancer ICD-10 code. So you would lose the specificity of the staging here, which in some cases actually might be very important to clinical trial insights. And if you're trying to look at reporting data, so I might be looking at AJCC cancer survivorship plans or cancer survivorship data, or any kind of other kind of research data like ICDO or SNOMED content. But generally, a lot of these are trying to bridge the gap between additional metadata points that don't really help a researcher track this patient population appropriately. And again, you just might know that this is a cancer patient, but you don't know it's a stage 3 breast cancer patient. So if you're trying to train AI and machine learning algorithms on that data set, you might be able to find that this is a stage 3 breast cancer patient, but how do you train the algorithm to look for the sensitivity of that kind of patient population when the standards don't report it? A lot of times folks look at billing data and it's not going to help you here. You definitely won't look at reporting data because it might not help you either too, because the standards are not kept up to date. And this is the problem that happens in the industry. Now you might be thinking to yourself, well, I do this on a regular basis, and I do use SNOMED. I do use other code sets that are out there that are present within my data to do these kinds of clinical trials. Well, I'll propose that a lot of times this is actually even further problematic. You actually might use a cohort query that might give you a false positive, false negative all the time. And this is a good example, right? If I'm trying to say, show me, again, same kind of patient diagnosis that might be coming through my enterprise data warehouse. Show me all patients that are stage 3 or stage 2. Let's just say stage 3. So in these cases, these are two types of concepts that might be present on a patient's problem list or on a past visit diagnosis. And if I have a patient with stage 3 breast cancer, these are the SNOMED codes that reflect it. Same thing with stage 3 chronic kidney disease. Now, as you notice here, these SNOMED codes for staging are actually the exact same for both breast cancer and CKD. So if I'm saying, show me both the SNOMED code and the stage 3 SNOMED code, I actually might get a false positive, false negative, and requiring a manual intervention to find those patients more appropriately. It takes time, it takes effort, and that cohort query might change in the future because the code sets might change to support it. So don't take my word on it. There's a lot of different studies that are out there that highlight this kind of problem. But if these are problems that are resonating with you, just trying to find patient populations, you definitely come to the right place to learn a little bit more about that workflow. But there's different strategies to help address the data quality gap that's happening within healthcare. And one of those studies that actually came out was one with PedsNet. If you guys are not familiar with PedsNet, PedsNet is a pediatric research registry with a lot of different pediatric health systems that are out there. And they wanted to know, as I wanted to look at standardizing diagnoses, could I use standard crosswalks to help fill in the gap and bring that historical data up to current standards? And if I did do that, did I lose the fidelity of that description at the point of care? Meaning very similar to what we just walked through. If I had breast cancer stage 3 and those code sets attached with it, if I needed to fill in the gap or bring that historical data up to current standards so I could query on the patient population more appropriately, what kind of percentage of loss in fidelity might I have had? And also what kind of percentage of the patient population might that incorrect mapping affected? So they looked at some key use cases here. In this case, something like reflex sympathetic dystrophy of the lower limb. At the time, the code sets that were captured were present here. But as they used a OMOP crosswalk or UMLS crosswalk in the data set, they actually noticed that the code sets here were actually not correct. And just again, these are probably problems that you guys have noticed in the past. Crosswalks will break, and they'll break quite often. Not only that, but to maintain the intent of those crosswalks takes time, takes effort, takes experience as well too. A lot of times, especially within research verticals, experiences that organizations might not have readily available. And in this case, this example affected 886 patients within the data set. However, had they used a company like IMO to help clean up, standardize, manage, maintain that data set, the cohort query must have been would have been a lot more accurate in representation of that data, as well as address the code crosswalk problem here of loss of anatomical site and post-coordination specificity, because IMO can actually address that directly within our concepts. Same thing with things like stress fracture of the right ankle. SNOMED in this case actually does not take into consideration laterality nor encounter type. So if those are important to any kind of clinical trial insight that you're looking for to find those patients or to track the outcomes of those patients. In this case, 38,000 patients were actually affected with an incorrect crosswalk here and the loss of fidelity of the original data set. However, had the organization actually used IMO behind the scenes, we can actually keep that content up to date and appropriate. So that, let's say, like in the future, SNOMED actually does pick up laterality and encounter type as SNOMED codes. We can actually keep that data up to date and maintained over time. Same thing with things like Klinefelter syndrome, rare disorder types that actually might not have equivalent crosswalks present here. In these cases, the crosswalks themselves actually represented an incorrect code crosswalk. And this is always problematic. Can you trust the originating underlying data? And in this case, 142 patients were affected here. So as you think about trying to increase sensitivity, focus on your appropriate patient populations while also removing false positives, false negatives. These are exact examples that using standard out-of-the-box crosswalks will not help you find those patients appropriately. But IMO can, and we do. And we can keep that content representative and up to date behind the scenes. So you might, if you've jumped on a few other presentations from us in the past, you'll probably notice a similar kind of understanding that IMO does here is that crosswalks will break and break all the time. So even if you did have code crosswalks from, let's say, SNOMED to ICD-10, in this case, the representation of breast cancer metastasized to pelvis, you'll only get an ICD-10 code of breast cancer. If you look at the other SNOMED codes that are present and required to be present to reflect the complexity of this kind of diagnosis, and you just wanted to cross like that to an ICD-10 code, this is just saying that you just had a metastases. This kind of code crosswalk will give you the closest, but you're missing that the anatomical site that the diagnosis had metastasized to, in this case, the pelvis. And in this case, you're just getting back to breast cancer. So again, there's a consistent thread of understanding here. If you're trying to fill in the gaps of data or maintaining that data with poor data quality, standardization, and operations, like just using crosswalks out of the box, you guys will have a tough time managing, maintaining, and gaining insights into those research studies to truly find and compare new treatments and baseline understanding of patient populations with the goal of improving patient care. You can't do that with crosswalks. There are different solutions that are out there that organizations can and do use. So one of them actually might be IMO. So who is IMO and really why do I care? IMO is really one of the best kept secrets in healthcare, and we'll tell you a little bit about it why. One of the use cases that always comes up is how well am I actually tracking disorders, or how well am I actually tracking different additional data points on patient populations? If I use just the standards alone, ICD codes or SNOMED codes to try to track rare patient populations, NIH GUARD actually has a clearly defined list of rare disorders that are out there. If you just use the standards alone, you're only going to get about 58% accuracy. You'll get a lot of false positives, false negatives that come along from the right. But having IMO not only identifies 100% of those NIH GUARD rare diseases, but as you're trying to query on the patient population, we've actually had studies with our IDN partners that the 3-to-1 time savings of manual iteration and manual intervention in trying to find those patients, actually IMO helped return that time back to that clinical researcher's desk so that they can focus on things more important to the organization. And don't take my word on it, even outside organizations have used IMO to gain better insights into data points themselves. So a pharma company partnered with IMO and their IDN partners, in this case, 9 Epic shops, to say, I needed to find a patient that had post-transplant consolidation, relapsed or refractory Hodgkin's lymphoma. That is a super specific, very rare disease that needs to find, that is clearly defined using clinical descriptions, but very, very hard to find using the standards alone. The closest standard that this organization was trying to query on was ICD and SNOMED to try to find those patient populations. And if you're trying to bridge the gap between multiple different disparate data sets, in these cases 9 Epic shops, and you're trying to find those patients more appropriately, those standards-based queries actually highlighted over 100,000 patients that might have been included within that query itself. Significant amount of false positives and false negatives, requiring a researcher to manually look through hundreds of thousands of records to try to find exactly the patient population that might have needed to have this kind of drug or this kind of treatment protocol that this life science organization was trying to achieve. But within 5 minutes, looking at the entirety of the 9 Epic Health Systems data set, we were able to find 108 patients immediately. That is the power of using not only standards-based queries, but also terminology-based queries and understanding of patient populations. So why is this a problem? Well, you need to find the right level of granularity, right? If I'm trying to look at that non-Hodgkin's lymphoma example, if I looked at ICD-10 codes, I got about 70,000 codes I can deal with. And ICD-10 is really good at being a bucketing system. But if I look at other different data sets like SNOMED, we've already identified that there are gaps in laterality or staging or encounter type that go direct to the problem of using either or both in conjunction. I might not get the level of accuracy nor relevancy that I'm looking for. And in some cases, just by the count that we're identifying here, the code sets actually might not reflect it. So IMO's terminology layer actually provides a interface term that is not beholden to the standards. It can be a lot more specific than the standards, getting to that levels of NIH GARD rare disorders. When the standards don't address it, IMO can. And the reason why that's very, very important, if I wanted to say, show me all patients with COVID that walked in my front door over the past 10 years, very, very easy value set query using terminology. But in many cases, COVID wasn't a description. So or it wasn't a code that was used or published by any regulatory body when it first hit the United States. So how are you able to do those kinds of value sets? Or if you're trying to say, show me all patients with chromosomal alterations of group C and X, those are very difficult cohort queries that you might need to look for, but very easy to use using IMO's terminology services behind the scenes and getting to the right level of specificity based upon the descriptions present on patient records, not just the code sets. So what is an IMO term? If you're not familiar with this, something like a concept-based architecture, there's a lot of synonymous descriptions inside that concept. IMO maps and maintains the entirety of the concept comprehensively to all the code sets. So if you're looking for things like SNOMED codes or an international code set, you're dealing with a partnership with an international entity, or you're trying to bridge the gap between your international entity and your United States-based entities themselves, you need to align the data appropriately at the description level. IMO can wholeheartedly help those kinds of research insights there. And if you're starting with a research code set, like something like ICDO, but you're having trouble adhering to your clinical trials cohort query, which is a standards-based query like ICD-10 or SNOMED, you need help bridging the gap between an ICDO code and an ICD-10 code. Very easy for IMO to help achieve that goal and do that with not only high levels of fidelity and accuracy, but maintenance over the time. Because that's the key piece here. You don't want to have highly paid clinical researchers maintaining codes when you can focus their efforts more on querying patient populations more appropriately behind the scenes. This is exactly what IMO can help do in greasing the skids for clinical research and making sure that that patient's personal decision of being included within a clinical trial accelerates their outcomes measurements appropriately, thus improving patient care, which is the end goal for any of these kinds of research trials and use cases. So how can IMO do this? Well, it doesn't matter if it's a description with a code, just an 837 claims feed, or a description with an old code, or a description no code. IMO's precision normalized engine can look at all of these different varying data points, align them to a preferred IMO description, and comprehensively map and maintain this data behind the scenes, including adding additional metadata points like HCC scores, ICDO codes, things of that nature too behind the scenes that might be important for your research and research outcomes. And we can do that with labs, immunizations, medications, past surgical histories, adverse events, name the domain, IMO can help you behind the scenes. This is the power of using an interface terminology to help enable and expand research use cases and help align the data that you're using in the point of care to your research use cases downstream. And even if you are using the same data warehouse to achieve both goals, having IMO services be your data quality double check is a key force multiplier in making sure that you don't have your clinical researchers keeping code sets up to date for these patient records. IMO can be that one-stop shop for you to do a lot of that work behind the scenes for your organization. And don't take my word on it. This is actually a good organization using standards-based value sets out of the box. The orange buckets here were standards-based VSAC messages and ECQM messages that the existing data set was able to query upon. So things like show me all patients with a psychiatric or mental health diagnosis, an overweight or obese patient, or a frailty symptom patient population. But because of the data quality problems present within their data, they actually had miscoded and undercoded many of their patient populations because they didn't bring that data up to current standards. So even for the research use case in clinical trials, we're trying to find those patients more appropriately for the patient cohort you're looking for. IMO wholeheartedly can help increase specificity, sensitivity, and maintain that data over time so that you can do easy push button queries on these patient cohort populations over time. And the blue is exactly what we were able to do for this kind of organization. So even though using ECQMs as a use case here, I hope that the understanding of how IMO can help in research and clinical trials can help your organization find more accelerated force multiplier workflow behind the scenes and focusing your researchers' efforts on things more important to the organization rather than just trying to keep these code sets or value sets or cohort queries up to date yourself. Thank you guys for your time, and if you have any questions, would love to hear them and see what the IMO can do for you.
All right, Andre, we have a few that came in. If we already have IMO core, why would you need to worry about standardizing our data?
Yeah, so IMO core is a dictionary maintenance operation used in point of care. Those dictionaries that are used in point of care as an end user is searching, capturing data. IMO will always provide the most up-to-date data behind the scenes. But as you guys all know, patient data can come from a lot of different organizations, both internal and external. And what I mean by that is you might have multiple different EMRs internally. You actually might have a health information exchange pulling data internally as well too, or you might have payer data, claims data, other kinds of research data points behind the scenes that actually might devalue the data quality of the underlying patient record itself. So even as that data flows downstream, IMO core might not have touched 100% of those data points. And we've actually seen this with quite a lot of organizations where as they're in aggregate organizing all of that patient data downstream, IMO core as well as normalizations engine can be the data quality double check to make sure that diabetes equates to diabetes in the aggregate layer. So even though you are a core licensee and prospectively creating good, clean, comprehensively coded data in prospective data entry, some of that data as it flows downstream might have lost fidelity. And you still need to maintain that in the data warehouse, especially for the use case of research and clinical trials. IMO can wholeheartedly help use and align that data appropriately for prospective side as well as retrospective analysis as well.
Awesome. All right, one more question. Does IMO support ICD-10 content?
Yes, we do. For those of you that don't know what ICD-10 is, that is an oncology facet of the ICD tables. ICD-10 histology, morphology, topography is mapped appropriately in IMO's content where appropriate. So when you are aligning an IMO description, let's say an oncology-based term, like I was showing earlier, breast cancer metastasized to pelvis or breast cancer metastasized to somewhere else in the body system, that ICD-10 morphology, histology, topography all comes along for the ride as metadata if it's needed. So if you need to go and start from ICD-10 and need to go to other standards, or you need other standards to go to ICD-10, IMO can be your secret decoder ring of content and has proven to be a great asset in accelerating that insights behind the scenes for organizations, both on the clinical trial side as well as the research side.
Awesome. All right, so it looks like that's it, and we're going to go ahead and close out for today. Thanks, Andre, for speaking. We hope you found the information for today's webinar useful. If you want any more information about IMO solutions, please contact your IMO client executive or email sales@imohealth.com. Thanks so much for attending, and please stay safe out there.